Hi there, my name's Kelly, and if you've seen some of the other videos, you know that I have an 11-year-old daughter, or who was 11 at the time, when she was diagnosed with anorexia in 2020. So in this video today, I'm going to be talking to you about what we went through to find out she had anorexia, as well as the journey to actually seeking some support. And what I'm hoping from this video is that you might identify channels of support that you may be able to get, as well as look out for those signs and symptoms. Like if you think that one of your children or teenagers may have an eating disorder, then you may recognize some of the things that happened to my daughter and our family that may be red flags for you that you may want to look into a little bit more. Okay. So as I said, my daughter was in primary school. She was in grade 6 when she was diagnosed with anorexia. And to be honest, if you had have told me there would almost be any other medical condition that I would have thought we would have had a diagnosis of other than anorexia, I feel like an eating disorder for us came so far out of left field that we didn't even suspect anything like this was going on. So she was in year 11. She was 11 years old. She was in grade 6 in primary school, and she started exercising as a form of fitness. She'd really wanted to improve and get a higher position in the cross country, and she also wanted to get into a specialist sports program in high school. So she started taking that fitness journey, that skills journey, and started exercising a little bit more. And along with that, she also started to take an interest in eating healthy, more healthy. I feel like our whole family and a whole, we have quite a healthy food mentality. So we have, really great wholesome meals. But for her, she really started looking at nourishing her body for performance so that she could improve her skills. So when all these changes took place with her exercising more and changing what she was eating, my husband and I, we truly thought it was because she wanted to improve her sporting ability. So at the same time with that, she started eating less and less variety of foods because she started considering that those foods were unhealthy. She also started telling us that certain foods made her bloated and gave her a stomach ache. So we really thought that might have been the case. So we bought her a lot of gluten-free alternatives and a lot of dairy alternative options for food. So this just continued, and it started off where someone might have been having Weet Bix and fruit for breakfast to eventually having sort of like a protein smoothie bowl. It kind of looked good to start off with, but by the end of it, it really just had the tiniest amount of yogurt in it and barely any fruit in it. So it progressively, over time started to sound like it was really healthy, but it got more restrictive and more restrictive and more restrictive with what she was putting in it. By August, my daughter had a really, really sore stomach ache in her lower groin area, right where the appendix sits. So she was admitted into hospital, and we did test after test after test after test. And despite the pain being in the same spot as the appendix, her appendix actually looked fine, and the medical professionals could not find anything wrong with it. But because the pain was still there and they thought that maybe it's something they couldn't see, she was, over quite a number of days, she was fasting for surgery in case she needed to go in and get it removed. So that kind of went off and on for a week or two. So eventually she's discharged, but before she was, I do remember the doctor saying to us, does she do a lot of exercise? And because they thought it could have been an abdominal muscle strain. And for me, that I just wrote that idea off straight away because I knew she was doing more activity to improve her sports performance, but I didn't think it would be enough to cause some sort of abdominal muscle strain. So I said that she didn't really do a lot of extra exercise because generally at that time, that's what I thought to be the case. During fasting for surgery, in that time frame, she actually lost quite a bit of weight because she was already on the path to losing weight. And when she went back to school, her friends and their parents were all commenting on the fact that she looked like she lost weight, and she was beautiful and how gorgeous she was. And this was all attention that she had because she was starting to look thinner than what she was, which at the time she was already a normal looking, healthy person. And at that time, that was something that we didn't know about. We didn't know that when she went back to school, people were saying that about her, and she was getting that feedback, that positive reinforcement that the things that she was doing, was positive. So the food and exercise regime kept going, and she went from cereal and toast for breakfast to making smoothies and smoothie bowls. And social media really, really fed into that pattern of eating and exercise for her. During that time, her body was dramatically changing, but we put it down to having a growth spurt because she was going through those sort of years, the 11, 12, 13-year-old years when typically adolescents or kids' bodies turn into adolescent bodies. So we kind of also put it down to that as well. One of the things that I did notice at the time was that she would go for a run to train for the school's cross country. But then she'd and that would be okay. But after a few days, she'd go for a run, but then need to do sprints after that. And then, a few weeks later, she was going for a run, doing sprints after it, and then doing all of this exercise in her room at nighttime. And again, it sounds obvious now, but at the time, we really didn't pick up on it. It really didn't seem like a red flag for us. So initially, I was thinking, wow, she's taking this fitness thing really seriously. And after being an athlete myself in my teenage years, I kind of thought, okay, she's just going down that pathway. Initially, I never suspected an eating disorder, but eventually something started to click and things started to fall a little bit more into place to build that picture. In October 2020, my daughter went to see her clinical psychologist that she was seeing for several years for anxiety. And earlier that year, I should say, she was also diagnosed with OCD, so obsessive compulsive disorder. So all of the things that she was doing, I kind of put down to doing those types of activities for OCD or anxiety, as well as increasing her physical fitness. I remember on this one particular occasion in October being called into the psychologist's office straight after her appointment. And I sat down and my daughter was sort of sitting in the side of the couch with some tears in her face. And the psychologist told me that my daughter had anorexia and that we needed to go to the GP for an eating disorder care plan so that she can get the help that she needs. I just remember being so shocked because I'd never thought, I had my own ideas about what a person with anorexia was like. I didn't feel like it would be something that would happen to us or any of my kids. I didn't know anyone out in the open that had an eating disorder, certainly none that I knew about. So for me, this was a really, really big shock. But as I started to dig into it, more and more of those things that have happened to us in the last 6 months fell into place. So we end up going to the GP. We have a fabulous GP, general practitioner, and she prescribed us in Australia the eating disorder care plan. And that gives you access to a rebated sessions for 40 psychology sessions, I think in 20 or 40 dietetic sessions. I can't quite remember now. But it gives you access to a psychologist and a dietitian to help you understand what's happening with your daughter, with your child's eating, and to get you back on track, because even the medical profession acknowledge that there's such intensive support needed for people with an eating disorder. I also remember at the time that our psychologist, I asked her what success she'd had in treating people with eating disorders, and she was a very, very experienced clinical psychologist, but she said most of the time when they'd had success with treating with people with eating disorders, it did involve medication as well. So there was some sort of medication required to assist in the recovery of the eating disorder, which was interesting because initially she wasn't on medication for a very long time. And as you'll find out in later videos, that was something we did choose to do, and it was really a savior from that time, and I wish we'd done it earlier. So this news was so devastating to us. I had to go home and tell my husband that that's what was happening. And again, I think he had more clued onto it than what I had. So it wasn't as news to him because he tends to be a little bit more, he can see more what's going on than what I can, because I tend to, be very, very busy in the day, and so is he, but he just tends to pick up those patterns a little bit earlier than what I do with things. So when I told my husband about it, we doubled down, and we knew the prognosis of it. We doubled down on our mission to get her to eat. And it sounds simple, right? It sounds like get your child to eat, just eat. And certainly that's what people around you may give you that advice. How hard is it to get somebody to eat? Oh, I make my kids eat like this. Nothing we did helped at all. In fact, it turned every single mealtime for us into a massive, massive battleground that we all hated. We were all dreading mealtimes coming up, not just her, but her siblings, her younger sister and her older sister as well. We hated mealtimes because this was going to escalate into a massive, massive fight where neither my husband or myself were backing down, but neither was the eating disorder with my child. So by December that year, we'd gone from October getting a diagnosis to December that year. We were down to having weekly checkups at the GP because my daughter was just losing weight and losing weight and losing weight, and there was zero we could do to help. It was the most frustrating time of our entire life. And it was awful to live in our house. I can only imagine what our neighbours thought with all the screaming that was going on. Meal times really sounded like we were trying to murder her because the screaming that would come to avoid eating a meal was just incredible. And the sicker they get, the harder that is. You cannot reason with them. You cannot rationalize with them. They get to a point where they're too unwell for anything that you can do for them. So by December, we were down to weekly checkups with our GP. We had the dietitian in place. We were still seeing the psychologist, but nothing seemed to help. It couldn't make any difference whatsoever. It was also about then that we found out that our daughter was secretly exercising in her room, and it ended up that she could plank for 13 minutes. She was doing so much secret exercise that we didn't even realize it was going on. By January 2021, her weight had dropped that much that she met the criteria to be referred to the local children's hospital's eating disorder clinic. So where in Australia, we went through Perth Children's Hospital. We were told in February by the hospital that she didn't meet the criteria, that she still wasn't sick enough, even though we were down to weekly GP appointments because the GP was so worried about her health. And shortly after that, the appointments went down to 2 times a week with the GP. So we went from weekly GP appointments fortnightly GP appointments to weekly GP appointments to having 2 times a week GP appointments because my daughter was so sick. We couldn't get her to eat. She was losing weight, but yet she still didn't meet the admissions criteria for the eating disorder service at the hospital. In fact, I remember on one occasion the admissions nurse or someone rang me up from the hospital to tell me that she didn't meet the criteria to even go on the waiting list, and I lost it. I absolutely lost it. We were just so broken, so confused. We just didn't know how to help her. And she was getting sicker and sicker. The GP was so worried, yet the hospital was not worried. They said their waiting lists were too long and they didn't have an ability to help her at that time. But because I absolutely lost it on the phone and I just cried, I was so distraught. I think the nurse kind of felt sorry for me. So she said, look, we'll just keep you on there a bit longer and we'll get the GP to send the information in and we'll just monitor you for a little bit longer. The other thing that they said that we could do, because we were struggling so much, was attend the Parents Eating Essentials course, which was a 2-day course designed to help parents understand eating disorders and to help administer or start doing family-based therapy in their home or family-based recovery from an eating disorder. And the only reason I could get access to that at the time was because I was so distraught and we just did not know what to do. So eventually I did that course, and I've got to say, I really left that course feeling so armed and with knowledge for recovery to help my child. And my husband did the course the same month. I did the course a little bit later, so he was on the same page. But unfortunately, despite having all that optimism and all that ability to be able to help my child, it was too late. By then, we did the course. It was way too late. Starvation syndrome had set in. You can have a Google of that, and I'll do a video on it one day. It's horrendous, which is why you cannot rationalize with a person with an eating disorder when they get to a certain point, because their brain is not functioning the way that a normal brain should be functioning. And I found out that despite me really trying to implement these strategies at home, all I was doing was just slowly keeping her above that line of her being able to get any help. So she was eating a few bites every day by then, but she was slowly declining. But my efforts and all of our efforts were just keeping her above the line to be able to get help. She wasn't getting any better, but she was slowing down the rate of descent for her. Finally, in March 2021, the GP insisted that we take the 60-minute drive to the Children's Hospital and present at the emergency department to see if we could get help. I should just say that at this stage, when we were knocked back from the eating disorder service, we were seeing the GP twice a week. My daughter couldn't even see. Her eyes, her vision, every time she stood up, her vision would start to go dark on her as if she was going to pass out. She was on strict bed rest from the GP. She couldn't go to school. She couldn't exercise. She couldn't do anything else. It was just really bed rest, and that was absolutely it. So even today, I'm so frustrated that a child has to be that unwell that they cannot stand up without passing out, and that still is not enough to get a person admitted into hospital for an eating disorder. It's truly shocking to me. So on the advice of our GP, we went into the hospital, and on this particular occasion, she was admitted into hospital for the first time with anorexia. And at that journey, she stayed in there for a month, and we subsequently had many ins and outs of the hospital. So she was staying in there for a month, and I finally felt some sense of relief that we were going to get some help from the hospital system and the eating disorder service. I will cover that video about the hospital admission in another video, because it is important for you to be prepared for it if it is going to happen to you, because it is a very shocking and surprising kind of journey to see kids with eating disorders in hospital. But I just wanted to highlight at this point in time my extreme frustration with the Australian healthcare system. When my daughter was diagnosed in October 2021 with anorexia, there was no help available for parents. Every help that was available was inaccessible. Psychologists have 1 to 2 year waiting lists. Dietitians that had expertise in eating disorders, you could not find them. So despite the government saying, here, have this care plan, you couldn't actually get the support that you needed with it. It was like you had this thing, but you couldn't actually use it. My husband and I desperately wanted to help my child, but there was no help available. We had to watch our daughter for 4 months get sicker and sicker and sicker, and there was no information and no support. Eating disorders are so different than any other childhood illness, and all the things that you want to instinctively do as a parent, they just don't work when you have a child with anorexia or with an eating disorder. You need to have that specialist knowledge around eating disorders to be able to help your child. When I contacted the eating disorder service in tears in February or March, I was sent a flyer of all the health professionals, and none of them had availability. They were so snowed under with other kids just needing support for eating disorders. I still believe, and the frustrating thing is, knowing what I knew from the Eating Essentials course that I did, if I had have known that when my daughter first got diagnosed back in October with an eating disorder, she would not have ended up in hospital. We could have helped her. I'm 100% guarantee. I was so armed with knowledge. I had so much confidence in my ability. But by the time we got access to that course, she was so sick that none of it could be put into practice. That is the story of us going from the original, when her symptoms started, until her first hospital stay. That is the journey that I call our journey to hell, that I call anorexia. But there are some things that I did want to say that were highlighted that I know in hindsight, and some of them have been from my daughter as well, who is still in recovery. So we still do have a lot of support from the hospital system. We're not out of the woods. We're not back to 100% normal life yet, but our life has returned back to normal, and our daughter has returned back to doing normal activities, which for us is a massive win. So I just wanted to take this last little bit of this video to reflect on some of the lessons that I felt like that might be valuable to you, taken out of that first 6 months of the symptoms starting and us being diagnosed. The first one is the eating disorder thoughts start well before the diagnosis. So we felt in our daughter, the eating disorder thoughts probably started 12 months before there were any physical effects that we saw. So have a look out for those behavioral things, because in our experience, it did start a lot earlier. There's a lot of covering up and masking of these eating disorder thoughts and activities, and they hide it for a very long time before they can be finally discovered. We found out in hindsight that our daughter had been unhappy in her body from a very young age. And this was a result of her being slightly more developed than her peers and even her siblings. And so that led to her having a really distorted body image from a very young age, being very unhappy with her body. So potentially this problem started a lot earlier than what we thought. One of the things she highlighted was that being weighed at primary school in grade 2 or 3 and then being lined up from lightest to heaviest just so that the teacher could explain mean, mode, and median to the class was completely humiliating for her. She found that experience a very humiliating experience, being weighed at school and lined up in class just to teach a maths experiment. It was absolutely atrocious. So, if you think that your daughter is, or your son or your daughter is heading into those kind of years, do not let them participate in that class. She went down she was encouraged also by her friends and their parents when they commented how good she looked because she was thin. And that kind of gave her the motivation, or that fed the eating disorder thoughts so that she could go further. She also went down a complete social media rabbit hole on TikTok and YouTube. They kept serving her up similar pro-diet, pro-eating disorder videos that as a young girl at 11 years old, she could not process. And they were repeated and repeated and repeated, serving those things up for her. I challenge you, go on TikTok and have a look what the videos are like. It is horrendous. If your child starts to talk about sore stomachs and wanting to reduce things like dairy or gluten from their diet, it can be an intolerance, surely, for some people, but it also can be the eating disorder talking. Because if you have a gluten and a dairy intolerance, it eliminates most calorie-containing foods like bread, pasta, cheese, yogurt, and all of those things that you need for a healthy, developing body. So always have that as a signal in your mind to think, is it truly allergies, or is it the eating disorder talking here? In our experience, it was the eating disorder, and it completely masked us and threw us off track. So you can see some of those are the lessons that we learned from that very early stage in hospital, and I hope maybe something in there might help you and your child, or your son or your daughter with an eating disorder, or maybe start to question things that you've already suspected for some time. If you're watching this video because your child or teen has been diagnosed with an eating disorder, or you've just had a feeling that something isn't quite right, then please comment below if you saw any of those signs or symptoms in your loved one with an eating disorder, or perhaps you saw something else that wasn't in my journey or my experience. So please write them down below too, so we can come with a great comprehensive list, so that in years to come, when families are on here searching for information, they have such a great list of all the different things to look out for in their loved one with an eating disorder. So let's help each other out and recognize those signs and symptoms and help people just like us. Thank you so much for listening to our journey of the first signs and symptoms to what it was like to our first hospital admission. I really appreciate you taking the time to listen. I genuinely feel for you and the journey that you're going on at the moment. It's a truly challenging time. Thanks for listening. Stay strong, look after yourself, and I'll see you in another video. Bye-bye.